Hi, welcome to Mathematics with Tom. I am Tom, and today we're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 error in regards to statistical tests. So let's take a look at this. Type 1, and type 2 errors. Or error. So we're gonna start out. I'm just going to define them, and then we're actually take a look at an example. So a type 1 error. Type 1 error is. I'm going to write it this way. It's using the probability notation. It's the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis, given that, now here's the key, given that the null hypothesis is true. So somehow you probably, if that is the case, you came to such a conclusion, you just probably experienced just some really oddly skewed, not skewed, but just unlikely data set. For example, maybe you'd gone out to find 4-leaf clovers and found a handful. Now you would reject the null hypothesis, but you knew that that wasn't really the case. So the next one, a type 2 error. The type 2 error is the probability of not rejecting the null hypothesis. Well, what would be different though? But what's different in this, remember this vertical line here is read as given that the null hypothesis is false. Okay, so it takes a little bit of getting used to these, but what I'd like to do is let's look at type 1 and type 2 errors you commonly hear when discussing medical tests. You go to the doctor runs some tests, and if a test of positive would indicate you have some kind of a malady. So let's see how what a type 1 and a type 2 error are regarding you and your doctor. So let's try this. So here's how this works. We need to have our null hypothesis. Our null hypothesis is that you are well. You are well. Our alternative hypothesis, H1, then is you are not well. Okay, so you go to the doctor because you're not feeling well. Now, two things can happen, and look at the two cases. The two cases is either the null hypothesis is false, so you really are sick, even though we thought you were well, or the null hypothesis is in fact true. So let's try this. So here's you. Maybe you don't feel so good. You've got a bit of a temperature. And that's a thermometer, even though it may not look like one. Here, let me give it some mercury. There's some red in it. Okay, so there we are. And you often see these done with tables. I actually think a decision tree is probably the easiest way to see what's happening. So I'm actually going to move my little character here. Let's put him right here. This will give me more space. So two things can happen now. Two things can happen. Either your null hypothesis is true, so you're really just fine, or the null hypothesis is false, so you're sick. So let's put this, you're well, not well, or sick. Either is fine. Now, here's what happens. The medical test is positive when the signs of the malady trigger the test. So for example, maybe a high white blood cell count, an abnormally high or maybe an abnormally low white blood cell count, or cholesterol levels, all sorts of different things. I'm not a doctor, but let's take a look at how these things might work. So if your doctor gives you your test and says the test comes back positive, it means that there's a probability that you have what that test was trying to test for. So let's take a look. When you get your test results back, only two things can happen. Your test is either positive. I'll write positive this time, but sometimes I just like using the symbols. Let's just erase that. Okay, so your test can come back positive, or your test could come back negative. Now, let's just complete the tree, and then we'll go through this thought process. So the other thing that could happen is you go in and you actually are sick. You take the test. Well, two things could happen there. The test either comes back positive or the test comes back negative. All right, let's go through each one of these. And let's start with the correct ones. These I think make sense. So if your null hypothesis is true, that you really are well, maybe you just felt a little under the weather because you hadn't slept well or something. So if you really are well and the test comes back negative, that's correct. That is a correct diagnosis. You're just fine. Okay, the other thing is you go in, you're not well, you're actually sick, and the test comes out positive. Well, that's exactly what we thought. You are sick. It comes back for being sick, so this is also a correct result. So these are our two correct results. Now let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at this top branch. You're well, but the test comes back positive. But that's not correct. That's not correct. That's not correct because you are well. It should have come back negative. Not correct. This is what we call a false positive. Okay. Now let's take a look at this other case. So the other case is when we come down, our null hypothesis is actually false. So the null hypothesis is false, meaning you're not well. So then the test, though, you get tested because you're not feeling well. The test comes back and the doctor says, you're fine. You probably just don't feel so. You probably just need to get some rest. Well, what happened? That's not correct either. Why? Because you're sick. You really are sick. This is called a false negative. This is called a false negative. Now, let's take a look a little bit about this. If you have a false positive, what are some of the ramifications from that? So if you had a false positive, well, some of the ramifications of that might be you have additional medical costs, additional testing, maybe you'd be put on testing, medication, treatment. And all of this, whatever else, medication, treatment, all of that, but it's unnecessary. Okay, now, so that's the ramifications of a false positive. A false negative False negative is that you're sick. You're sick and left untreated. And left untreated. If it was maybe just a simple flu, it's probably not so bad. But what if it was some kind of serious illness? Well, in that case, then that illness is just going to continue in your body or bringing harm to your well-being and so maybe by the time they finally figure out what had happened, the malady is at some stage where they really can't help you. But had the tests come back positive initially, it would have been something that could have been easily addressed. So false negative is the malady goes untreated until you get tested positive later on. Or, well, you can imagine what would happen if you were go untreated. All right. That's type 1, type 2 error in a very common setting, that of the medical field. Doctors and researchers and insurance companies are very well aware of these things, and I'd like to believe that most of them do their best to minimize these. Hope that helps. Thanks for watching.